Thank you very much for joining us. And this is Nomadic Sky's second webinar about our journeys that we're running at the moment. This one is focusing on Dolpo, an area that's very close to our hearts. It's where this all started. Back in 2015, I will explain a little bit more about that. Just as a quick introduction, my name's Gavin Anderson. I'm one of the founders of Nomadic Skies, based up here in the northwest of Scotland. And it's my absolute great pleasure to also have with me Jigme Lama. Jigme.
Hello, namaste to everyone. My name is Jigme Lama. I come originally from Humla, northwest Nepal. And I used to work in development works there. That's where I met Gavin in 2015. And then at the moment, I'm also involved with Nomadic Skies. Thanks.
That's great. So just a little bit of background. As Jigme said, we met back in 2015. It was actually just after the earthquake. I've been working a number of years in Nepal on rural development projects. The earthquake hit and the funding for the work I had been doing was diverted away to earthquake relief. But I was asked fortuitously to go into the northwest of Nepal to investigate the emerging trekking tourism. And Jigme and myself did that together. And this is really where the foundation of Nomadic Skies came from. You know, Jigme, you remember that very well when we went into the northwest.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And there was this aspect of the way trekking was working. Maybe you're an expert in the trekking. Explain a little bit more about what we saw.
Yeah. So, I was involved in tourism and trekking since 1996 when West Nepal was opened as a gateway to the West Tibet region. And also these areas were being opened because originally before that, these were like completely restricted. And I was involved. And then since tourism evolved there, it was the main concerns, of course, were there's limited facilities and, for example, accommodations, trained people, and that was one aspect. But after the trekking, industries evolved and they started operating. Another concern was the benefits to the locals. And then most of the tours, they operated from Kathmandu and the center, and people, because of the lack of trained people or various reasons, communications and other reasons, the manpower were from outside, the resources, food and supplies were from outside. And then the tourists, they went on a set, organized schedule from one camp to the others. So very little was, in terms of incentives were coming to the locals. So yeah, so lack of benefits, lack of employment, even if the tourism developed, these areas, remote areas such as Humla and Dolpo did not benefit much because most of it was operated from Kathmandu. So that was one of the concerns.
Yeah.
Or the issues that we encountered during our visit. Of course, yes.
Yeah, it was the kind of, what we really saw as kind of form of fast trekking, where we really felt that a lot of the people were not, there was very little interaction between trekking groups and particularly some of the upper mountain areas, which seemed such a loss. And it's really where Nomadic Skies, the foundation of Nomadic Skies came from. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Jigme with me on this call. He's going to be discussing in a little bit about the spirituality of this area. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through a bit of a visual journey and explanation of our journeys in Dolpo, what they involve. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll show you a presentation. So yes, let me take you through get it working. I'm going to explain a little bit about the Dolpo area, and then I'm going to take you a visual journey to explain what some of the highlights or some of the areas that we visit during this journey. So where is Dolpo? First of all, we probably all know where Nepal sits, between China and India. And on this map, if people don't know, this is where Kathmandu is, down here in the sort of central area, the hill area of Nepal. This is, for reference, where the famous Mount Everest is. That's where a lot of the people go. Dolpo is at the other end of the country. This is, and you'll notice I actually call it Dolpa there. So let me just briefly explain that. We tend to use the word Dolpo, which refers to the Tibetan, the upper Dolpo area. Dolpa is the whole district, and it also includes the lower areas. So you'll see that difference in spelling Dolpa and Dolpo. Dolpa being the district, Dolpo being the upper areas. And you'll notice right up here in the sort of far northwest, this is Humla, from where Jigme is from. These areas, Mustang, Dolpa, Mugu, and Humla, are these sort of high Himal areas with a kind of, in the upper areas, with strongly Tibetan cultures. And that's where we're focused in on. What those lines show with the flights is that when we actually go, we take 2 flights in, one that takes us down in the evening to a border town on the Indian border called Nepal Gunj, and then a very early morning, a spectacular morning mountain flight up that takes us to Lower Dolpo. So Dolpo itself is a very high, it's the largest district. It's in the very high Himal area of northwest Nepal. And it's actually tucked behind Dhaulagiri. Dhaulagiri is the 8th highest mountain in the world. So it's one of the mountains over 8,000. It's 8,172 meters. So because it's tucked behind Dhaulagiri, it's actually an area that's quite arid, quite dry. But the valleys that we're focusing on are sort of carved into the high Himal. This is actually a satellite photograph. I managed to get this from a satellite a few weeks before we were trekking in there in April 2019. And it shows the sort of valleys cutting into the sort of high Himalaya. At that point, there was quite a lot of snow on the ground. And if you take a sort of focus a little bit more in there, these are the valleys that we're sort of going up to explore. You'll maybe see a dark Y shape at the top right there. That's actually Lake Foxundo. So that's Foxumdo is actually probably the better pronunciation. Sum meaning in the Tibetan 3. So it's 3 rivers coming into that lake, and you can actually see you've got the Suligad that we follow up to the south of the lake, and then you've got the lakes coming in from the north side as well. So just I popped on there a few little dots showing some of the sort of villages that we collaborate with, where we start down the very sort of bottom left corner. That's the villages around the airstrip where you fly into. That's the Tuliberi River Valley, and then we start moving north, cutting as you'll see in a little bit to some of the higher villages up the mountain Hindu villages on the side of the valley, and then we begin to move up to the upper valleys, which are the areas of Bon religion. So just to give a little bit of detail about our actual journey, it's a 19-day, 18-night journey. It starts and finishes in Kathmandu. And what it actually involves is an exploration of the Kathmandu cultural sites. It's 4 nights, 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end. The 2 at the beginning are essential because we have to organize trekking permits and do the sort of logistics before we're able to go into this area. You can't get trekking permits before you arrive in Dolpo. And 2 at the end. It's always quite good to have 2 nights just in case there's any delays on flights and things. It's also quite nice just to relax before a longer flight out. So we do, as I said, fly from Kathmandu to Dolpo, return, taking 2 flights each way. Our trip involves 11 days of trekking and also a lakeside ascent, which is kind of optional, but it's, as you'll see from the photographs, it's something that's pretty spectacular, an amazing trip to do. The total trek distance is just under 100 kilometers, around about 97 kilometers. It's a bit over 60 miles. So in terms of the average days, they're not terribly long, about 8.8 kilometers, 5.5 miles. It seems quite low, but actually one of the things we do is also to make sure that we ascend quite slowly, because we are ascending to 3,700 by the lake, about 4,000 at the lake viewpoint. So, that's quite a high ascent. So it's really good. And in fact, the trips we've taken, people don't tend to suffer from altitude because of that sort of slower ascent we take. But also what's critical to us, as you'll hear in this presentation, is the idea that we are not trying to pack in really heavy days, because we want to be able to have cultural exploration, interaction. That's really important to our journeys. I wouldn't say it's an easy trek. Some of the days feel quite tough, but it's not a massively difficult trek either. I would call it a sort of medium in terms of its difficulty. And it involves 13 camp nights beside or being hosted by the local communities. So this shows the routes that we take. Starting in Jafal, which is close to the airstrip that we fly into. This is the Tuliberry river valley here. Our first night is spent down in the Tuliberry, and then very quickly, when we start moving north on the second day, we start ascending to some of the higher villages, Perlegowen and Rahagawen, which is here. And then we carry on a high traverse until we come back into a very tight valley at the village called Chepka, and we follow the route up through a very tight, this is the Suligad River, up to these higher villages up in the north. And if I focus in on those, you'll see the villages of Rechi, which is the first one we come to, Hungmo, Rike, and Ringmo, and I'll show you photographs of those. There's a couple of gompas, gompa meaning monasteries, that I'm also highlighting. Thexan Rabaling Gompa, the mountain gompa, very seldom visited, which is really quite superb, actually. Absolutely superb mountain gompa on the side of the hill. And the absolutely beautiful down by the lake here, the Trasang Sholing Gompa, amazing places. So those are the upper valleys that we trek through. These are the areas of sort of Bon culture. And if you want to have a look a bit more on our routes, the maps, there is on our websites, if you scroll down, you can actually get onto an interactive map, and it's on Google Earth, so you can zoom right in and sort of have a look. But these are the valleys that we're sort of focused in on, and you'll see all the camping spots, and you can have a little play on that, which is quite fun. Being a map person, I always enjoy that. So some of you might be aware that one reason Dolpo is sometimes known by people is that it featured in a cult, an award-winning travel book by Peter Matheson, an American author, called The Snow Leopards. Peter Matheson joined a very famous, a very influential, who's still alive actually, a field biologist called George Schaller, on a journey to the Crystal Monastery. This is a photograph of the Crystal Monastery that we took earlier last year when we went up there. It was a pretty tough journey for them. They actually walked all the way from Pokhara up there. And he wrote a very interesting book that talks about the spirituality, the wildlife very well. I would suggest didn't talk about the people of Dolpo as well, but it is a fascinating book, and it certainly put Dolpo on the map for many people. And if you're interested, we took Peter Maston died a few years back, and there is an author, Lance Richardson, who is in the process of finalizing a major biography on Peter Matheson. It sounds to be fascinating. And Lance asked us to take him last year up to Shea Gompa, and that's why we took him all the way to that place. And if you go onto our YouTube, you'll actually find a little webinar also on that, if you'd like to find a little bit more about that. Once Lance's book has been published, we plan to get him on, and we'll discuss more about that. And even we're hoping to get him to come across to the UK to do some talks on the book and the journey he took. So let me talk a little bit about the features of Nomadic Skies journeys. you've probably already picking this up, but a few aspects that I think are quite unique. One is we focus on slower trekking. As I said, slower doesn't necessarily mean easier, but what we try and do is build time and flexibility within our schedules for meaningful interaction and cultural exploration. It's really important to what we do. We're focusing on off the beaten track. Some of the villages I'm going to show you are villages that are hardly visited. It's been decades in some cases since foreigners actually stayed there in these villages. We do cut back occasionally onto the slightly more trekked trail. Ringmo is a slightly more visited village, but when we're off in the places like Perlegowan, Rahagawan, even Pungmo, Rike, these are villages that are well off the beaten track. We're doing this with local communities, and when I say that, they're our trail guides. We have somebody coming from the Hindu villages with us. Chandra Shahi is our usual guide there, who explains the culture of the Hindu villages. And then we're also with Dawa Dolpo, who's from Pungmo village. But we're also using local village people, herdsmen, to explain the culture, and working very much in collaboration with them. And we always pay them as if they were fully trained guides as well, the local people. We have a particular focus on exploring mountain and remote culture, sharing and learning. And I think this is what actually drives me so much, I find these journeys fascinating, because every time I go back, I learn something. I learn many things new. And that idea of sort of sharing and learning is just really fundamental to Nomadic Skies journeys. And of course, both Jigme and my background is actually in development. I have over 30 years experience working in international development. This is what brought me to this area. So what's incredibly important to us is to find ways in which our journeys help in terms of income for local mountain communities. So we try to employ, buy local wherever we can. Also, looking at cultural heritage, we link a lot with the monasteries, the Gompas, so also contributing there towards maintenance and supporting, and looking also at indigenous wisdom, which I think is so valuable, and how our interest in indigenous wisdom can also mean that younger people gain interest as well, and trying to maintain that. So those are the kind of features of Nomadic Skies journeys. So I'll take you through a few of the sort of, the visual tour of the journey and a few of the places that we'll visit. What I always like to put up first is just to keep reiterating that the most important thing about our journeys are the people, the meaningful interaction and sharing. And that's something that, I think every time we keep taking groups up, we get to know people. The people we're now moving amongst and with up in Dolpo, they have become friends, not just people we interact with, in terms of buying services, but they really have enhanced our journey in such a way that they often invite us in to share, to listen to music, etc. So people are the actual fundamental part of our journey. As I said, our journey starts and ends in Kathmandu. Some of you probably know Kathmandu. It's a rather crazy city, surrounded by hills. A city you can love and, I wouldn't quite say hate, but love, and there's some aspects that are not so nice, the pollution, the crowds. But actually, when we're there, we do an exploration of some of the Buddhist cultural sites. The one you're seeing up in the top left, that is Swayambanath, Bodhanath, which is another stupa, a very important stupa. And what you also tend to find when you're in Kathmandu is there's quite often a lot of festivals happening, and it's good to tap into those. So despite it being a sort of essential for us to be there a couple of nights, it's actually a really great place to visit and to experience. When we do get to Dolpo, it's a completely different change of pace. As I mentioned, these are the lower valleys. We will be coming up onto some of these higher villages, Perlegowan, Rahagawan, up, rejoining the trek, the main trekking route, which isn't a very frequented trekking route. but at Chepka. These are the lower, more Hindu valley areas. And what you'll find around Jafal is larger. This is Jafal being the airstrip, larger Hindu villages, built steeply on the hillsides. And then when we begin to move north up the Suligad River Valley, we climb out of the valley. And this actually is something over the last few journeys that we've evolved from our journeys. We were originally going actually just down the valley side, but it's much more spectacular to climb out of it and actually go to the villages that are these small mountain Hindu villages, which are actually on the original trade routes that linked, we'll talk a little bit about the sort of trading that happened between Tibet and the hill area in a little bit. But these villages were actually on the main trekking route, because before 1970s, the route right down the valley didn't actually exist. So we're refinding those old trekking, those old trading routes and staying in these villages. So what you're seeing in the bottom is the village of Perlegowen, and the one on the top right is Rahagawan. Perlegowen is one of the villages I mentioned, which they actually said when we stayed there first earlier last year, we were the first foreigners they remember staying in that village for at least 30 years. So it shows how off the beaten track it is. It's a superb village. You see the sun go down on the sort of mountains around, and incredibly friendly as well. Then we move up the valley, up the Suligad, following a tight river valley, up to and that is on the sort of trekking trail, the main route now between Upper Dolpo and Lower Dolpo. Because when I talk about a trekking trail, what I really mean is it's also the village trails. What you'll find is a lot of local traffic going up and down. At certain times of the year, you'll be finding yaks moving up and down those paths. You'll also be finding mules taking goods up and down, as well as some trekkers. In this area, actually, you get a lot more Nepali trekkers than you actually get foreign trekkers. But the river itself, the Suligad, is absolutely beautiful. And you come up to the village of Rike, which I call a kind of bypass village, because the trekking trail actually comes past it and bypasses the actual old village. And we have friends there. Who you're seeing on the right is Pusba Gurung, who's just a wonderful host, an artist. She makes the most wonderful mountain tea that she collects from the herbs from the mountain. She herds goats, and looks after children up in the high mountain pastures when they move up there in the summer. And she's also a craftsperson doing weaving. So she's somebody we link to in those villages, as well as others. Fantastic host, and it's really nice to actually spend time, in a village like this, a village that usually is just bypassed by trekkers. Then we divert off to the Kangmara Valley, Pungmo, which is an utterly beautiful valley. Again, a valley that's hardly hidden. And at this point, we've actually moved from the more Hindu villages. We've moved now into the Bon villages, and we'll talk more about the Bon religion with Jigme. But as you can see, as you move up towards Pungmo, you're beginning to get amongst the sort of higher mountains. You're seeing the Bon Chortens, like this one. The village itself is really traditional, Tibetan style of buildings. And this is actually the home of Dawa Galpo, who is our very valued local guide for the Bon areas. And this is him with his mother and his young son. His wife ran away; she didn't want her photograph taken. But Dawa is really fantastic. He's somebody who was he's very unique because he was educated in Kathmandu, but tragically, his father was killed in an avalanche on the Kagmara Pass, and he decided to come back. And despite his education, he came back to live his life in the village of Pungmo. And now we're supporting him with working with him as a guide. And it just seems really important to us to sort of support people like him because it's part of the problem of depopulation. Another village that we'll visit is a village which is in a most stunning position. It's the village of Rike in the Madua River Valley. That sort of when you've come out of the Suligad, you break into a much larger valley below where Foksundo Lake is. And so this is Rike. You can maybe see it down on the bottom here. And this is the sun rising on Rike. Sorry, on above Rike. It's the Kanjaroa Mountains that you're seeing there, and you'll see a massive waterfall. That's Nepal's highest waterfall. What happens with Rike is there's actually a path that cuts up here, up this side of the mountain, and goes into what is the Foksundo Lake Valley. And Rike, again, is a village that's kind of completely ignored. When we first went to start bringing people in 2019, or 2018, actually, we were the first trekking groups to go and stay in that village. And it is a really beautiful traditional village with traditional Tibetan houses. But as I mentioned, it's a village that is depopulating. It's got very few families actually left in it, which is really tragic. That photograph in the bottom right, the village of Rike is down in the right-hand side in that flat area. There's actually another village that's on this flat area that's slightly to the left of it. That is the village of Madua. And it's a village that Peter Matheson, his book, talks about and liked very much. But it's a village now that is totally depopulated. So, to me, it all seems very important that we interlink with Rike in our journeys. Then the last of the villages that we link into is the larger village of Ringmo, which is a lakeside village. It's a village that gets a little bit more tourism. But it is a superb village. And in our trip, we spent 2 nights in Pungmo, a night in Rike, but we spent 3 nights in Ringmo because it is an area that there is a lot of cultural and landscape interest. One being the really phenomenal Lake Foksundo, which we'll talk about more. The village is in a superb location, very traditional. You can see in the bottom right, that's a traditional Tibetan building, 3 stories. The lowest story is for the animals, the middle story for people to live, and the upper tends to be a variety of workspace on the right-hand side on the rooftop, but a shrine and storage area as well. And that's fodder that's drying on the roof. The people of this area, the villages of Rike and Ringmo, they are seasonally nomadic, meaning that they actually move down the mountains to winter villages during winter months, but then move back to their more permanent villages during the spring, summer, early autumn. One point to keep reinforcing is one of the reasons we do spend longer in villages is the ability to interconnect with music, culture, tap into the wisdom of these villages. What we're finding on all our journeys is we're often invited by the lamas to come in to see ceremonies that are happening. The one on the top left was a ceremony at the Thasang Sholing Gompa. But we've also, on the more recent trip, we were invited into homes to see blessings being made. The lamas actually came to our camp to bless our journey. And we were invited in to also see the traditional dancing that happens, the singing and dancing, by households. We also tap into local, the Amchis, the local Tibetan healers. You'll see here where we're actually we're being shown and explained a lot of the use of herbs and the traditional medicines of this area. So that's also sort of fundamental to what we are looking at in these journeys. The Gompas, as I said, Gompas meaning the monasteries of Dolpo. There are a number of temples, a lot of Chortans that we'll visit, But the two main gompas, this is a much smaller one, a much more local one, a very, very unvisited one. And it's called the Thegcheng Rabaling Gompa. And that one is above Pungwo. It's a mountain gompa. It's a really basic building outside with the most beautiful journey to get to it. And you see on the right-hand side, that's the Lama's house. He has a fascinating interconnection with wildlife. When you're going there, you're finding tracks of snow leopards. And if any of you read the article written by Carl Flynn, you know, she talks about going to this gompa, meeting the Lama, who talks about the animals that come down on a regular basis to graze in harmony together, even the snow leopards, he was saying, around the gompa. And it's somewhere that we've now built into our journeys. So as I said, a beautiful trekking route up there and actually a fascinating place. And of course, the lakeside monastery, which is just sublime, a place to go and actually, spend quite a bit of time. The Trasang Sholing Gompa. And it really is, looking up to the peaks of Kanjaroa Himal, the lamas at that monastery are very good friends of ours. And as I said, they're people who often invite us in. We specifically ask the lamas not to put on things for us in terms of, sort of tourist type things. But if it's appropriate to invite us in when there's actually ceremonies happening in the village or the monastery itself. So that's the focus we have around it. And inside the monasteries, I'm going to come back to this slide in a little bit with Jigme, but they are beautiful. The religions are very complicated. Jigme's going to give you a little bit of an insight into it, but they are beautifully decorated. On the outside, you'll find the mani stones, the carved stones. This is the bottom right. You're seeing a carved mandala and masks. So very beautiful. And of course, at the apex of our trip, there is Lake Foksundo. Lake Foksundo is fascinating because it's a lake of the most amazing color. This photograph we came down, this is when we did the Footsteps of Matheson trip. So this is actually in June, when monsoon was almost beginning to start. We had to go quite late because we were having to go over very high mountain passes for that journey. We don't go over high mountain passes in the journey that we usually take. But we went a bit later in the year, and you can sort of see the color of the lake there. If you go, when we usually go, you'll find the lake a kind of color that makes it look like you've almost photoshopped it, a deep aqua reflecting the sky. That is because it is a glacial lake, and mica and other rocks that have been powdered have been washed into the lake, and it basically has a reflective quality. So it reflects the sky, and often you'll find it this deep aqua color. At other times, you'll find it this deep, deep blue color. This is a different time of year, but really just a superb lake. And there is a path that goes up, sometimes called the Demon's Path, because of the history of the lake. If you want to know the legend of the lake, you'll have to come with us to Dolpo, and locals can explain it. But it has to do, the color has a mythology behind it, and it has to do with a demon who flooded that area and created that color of the lake. So there is a superb path, a rather heady path. Animals use it, that actually goes up to a wonderful viewpoint. And that is the apex of our trip at 4,000 meters. And this is the land of the snow leopards. This is one of the areas of the Himalayas that reputedly has some of the highest concentration of snow leopards. And part of our journeys more recently have focused on understanding more about the interrelationship between mountain communities and the snow leopards. We find tracks of snow leopards, we find the scat of snow leopard, and snow leopard has become part of the sort of culture of this area. And Dawa Galpa, who's our guide, he operates he's one of the people operating an insurance scheme. There's a lot of predation by the snow leopard on local animals, and he runs a sort of little poster that's trying to explain to people about how the insurance scheme works. So if someone gets an animal killed by snow leopards, they actually get insurance through this. So exploring this interrelationship between the local communities of snow leopard is quite fascinating, and it also brings us into looking a little bit more at some of the conservation practices that are around the Bon religion. But Jigme, let me ask you a little bit about this, because you also live in an area of snow leopards, the interaction between local communities. Tell us a little bit more about your experiences of how people view their relationship with snow leopards in these mountain areas.
Yeah, so yeah, until I think around 1990s, we heavily relied on animal husbandry. So our parents, our families own large herds of sheep and goats. We have herds of horses and yaks and zoos. So when we took them in the pastures, the sheep and goats, usually the smaller animals, they used to be occasionally predated or attacked by the leopards, and we lost animals. So so there was actually, and then the smaller cattle, yaks and zoos, they used to be to be attacked, and we used to lose animals a lot. But in later years, as the population grew, and then people, so it's just a number of, I don't know, it's just some herders, they used to also maybe build traditional stone traps to trap the leopards, and there has been some like elimination of the predators, but in later years there was increased sense of conservation, under the leadership of some lamas or monks, spiritual leaders in the society. So that conservation aspect was also growing. And so anyway, there was some conflict. We lost animals, but also the need of conservation, and then the value of these wild animals was also a thing, that you couldn't randomly go and hunt, that it was associated with the local spirits, the nature, because we didn't, they were under the, there was always the wild animals always associated with the local spirits, and then the local nature or something like that. And people always hesitated hunting or poaching, and then they just found ways to coexist in some ways. So, through better protection of your animals, a better herdership, something like that. But then again, in 1990s, we also, I think it was like 2003 or so, I was also associated with some conservation initiatives, like the Snow Leopard Conservancy USA. They provided some funds, and we did, I was involved in some conservation activities whereby we found ways to protect the corals of the shepherds. And then also, if the animals were lost, there was some kind of link with some kind of compensation in the villages. So I was involved in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the, I think the interesting aspects that we tapped into in some of our journeys was that there is a traditional conservation promoted by the lamas and the spirituality. I think in both Tibetan Buddhism and the Bon religion, and but people felt that the rules coming in from the national parks were almost imposed from the outside, and there was always a feeling that there should have been more effective collaboration between the conservationists and the local people, and that would have actually worked much better and had more people on side if that had happened. Would you agree with that, Jigme?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So so there was already a traditional conservation modality, whereby the community leaders or the spiritual heads, they used to have that. And then in the later years, when the community forests were formed, then national parks were formed, these ideas, the methodologies were more or less imposed from the top. So in terms of not only the conservation, also the benefit sharing. So there's been some conflicts, but now again, with the new governance systems, things to be, coming more or less, the locals are again coming at the leadership of conservation initiatives now. So they're at least being heard too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things we found really interesting is to speak to the lamas about their beliefs around the snow leopard and the importance of uh, not just paying attention to snow leopards. They're the kind of, the one that we always focus in on, but actually all wild animals, and a belief that wildlife are the livestock of the deities. So if you hurt and injure wildlife, you're actually going to have problems later down the line. Is the sort of expectation. So it's a really fascinating area to explore. Also, to hear more from the herders about their sort of experiences, with snow leopards. And I've often found it quite humbling about how forgiving people seem to be, because we've met herders in the village of Rike who in one season has lost 8 goats, which is, to a poor family, is a huge loss, but actually quite sort of philosophical about it, believing the snow leopards, they're actually taking their livestock into the land of the snow leopards, so they have to expect some loss. Fascinating.
Yeah, I agree.
So one of the other aspects to mention, I want Jigme to maybe explain a little bit more about this, is that particularly in these upper areas, the Bon areas, the upper Dolpo areas, these people are the traders of the high Himalaya. So Jigme, just explain a little bit more about this. This is a photograph by an artist, Tenzing Norbu, who is from Dolpo, but I think it's really interesting. Maybe you explain a little bit more about the photograph and this lifestyle of trading.
Yeah, so this picture depicts a kind of a traditional lifestyle that existed until the 1990s, I believe. And then I was involved when I was young in one of these journeys where we, people who live in the border between Tibet and the lowlands of Nepal, we had yaks, we raised yaks and zoos. We had sheep and goats in the lower areas. And then, because the lowlands below us, they cultivate grains and crops, and just behind the mountains, you can see the pass. It's Tibet, where the land is actually more or less, they don't have. It's very dry and like semi-desert-like, so they don't have crops, but they do because of the lakes and plateaus. They have salt. So our grandparents, our ancestors, they used to then bring salt from Tibet on these pack animals, and then they used to bring it down to the lowlands and exchange with the grains. And then when they took the grains and then took it back into Tibet and exchanged. So the trading between grains and salt, the exchange rate was very high actually. So the salt, one is to almost like, they used to almost multiply like 4 or 6 times, almost like 10 times in some cases. The profit was at that ratio. So they used to make a good subsistence out of that. And as you can see on the back there, those are the heavy sacks of, I think probably they're carrying grains to Tibet. And then the camp that you see below, it's on one of the high passes. And at the evening when they stop over, they actually build a wall of those packs, and they make the shelter. And in some cases, when it rains, we used to actually just put a kind of a rock on top of it. But on not a rainy day, we just protect it around to keep warm from the strong wind and cold climate there. And yeah, so this is how the life actually subsisted until the 1990s, when things began changing. I think it's around like 1980s, things began changing when the lowlands, the road was coming closer and closer to the villages. And also because of the political changes in Tibet, the strict border demarcation, and also the Chinese began supplying crops, and they improved in agriculture. And then they started supplying grains from mainland China and other parts of Tibet. And in lowlands, the government started subsidizing salt that came from India. So there was the trading of salt from Tibet and then grain from lowland. It just gradually, they made it obsolete for local people here, because the salt in the lowlands was supplied by the government on a subsidized rates, which was more or less funded, by by international agencies or or even government. People could buy, get salt on cheaper prices already, and then they didn't need that. And then up in the north, the Chinese government was supplying crops for the Tibetan people from the mainland. So the need of the trade actually, slowly died out that way. And then that's because of that, then people actually, ended up looking for alternative sources of income. And that's actually how also, I started with, or I was working with then the local leaders in Humla and Dolpo also. Then they started exploring alternative ways of income. And then tourism was one of those potential areas because of its, unique culture, mountains and others. So tourism was one of the alternatives, because the still agriculture is not, because of the limited land, cultivable land, although people still subsist in agriculture, but they still need a subsistence ways of income after the trading of salt and grains died out. And tourism is seen as an alternative source now.
Yeah, and I think there is some trading still going on, but not the traditional trading of the salt and the grains, because the demand's gone. But people will go up to collect manufactured goods from China to bring down to the hill areas. That's the one bit of it that still exists. So people still do take yaks over.
Yeah. So now,
yeah,
people still take now yaks and horses, but now they exchange different commodities. Now, instead of importing grains from Nepal, I think they're bringing, manufacturing goods from Tibet and selling it in the lowlands. And then taking them, I think after, it's been a couple of decades that they're taking the medicinal herbs and selling in Tibet and China. So the new form of exchanges have been occurring also.
Yeah. And what people generally say is the profitability is a lot lower than it used to be. Although a lot of that trade, the barter trade, I understand it. But
yeah.
And we've skirted around this, the sort of Bon spirituality, which I think is really fascinating. Can you just explain a little bit more about Bon and its interrelationship with Tibetan Buddhism?
Yeah, so nowadays it's just when we go into the mountain areas, so Bon and Buddhism, it's just so much intermixed that it's just difficult to distinguish between the two. But when we look into it, I think the Bon before Buddhism arrived in Tibet I think like as early as 6th century and 7th, 8th centuries, Bon, I think used to be the traditional cultural practice there. But again, it was a different Bon that we see in Dolpo now. It was mainly the spirituality mainly consisted of recognizing the natural world outside as spirits. For example, the mountains as abodes of some spirits, the forest, rivers, lakes as abodes of some supernatural forces. And they gave names to those, like name of the deities and associated with those forces. And then the tradition of shamans actually, I think, seemed to have arose from there. Shamans as representing the shaman through which the actually spirit would enter, and then the priest who would actually communicate with a shaman, and then they would communicate between the supernatural and then the lay people. And there were various rites, there's various, practices that arose with it, like like making offerings to the deities, and oracle or divination and sorcery in some cases. So all these things arose, but again, the central idea was to find ways to connect and understand this unseen supernatural world. So anyway, that's how the shamans and then the priest actually came about. And then one could see various, when you go to a Bon priest, you could see various, there's not much of a symbolism or statues or like that. They would have a certain place, such as not even a sophisticated temple, but just a kind of a site, maybe under a tree or under a rock, where it is considered this is where the shamans would go and worship or communicate with that supernatural world. So that actually existed until the 6th, 7th centuries. And after Buddhism came, then the exchanges of ideas occurred. So a lot of Buddhist elements were added into the Bon societies and Bon culture. And also the Buddhism, when they came in Tibet, also actually adopted a lot of traditional beliefs, adopted a lot of deities there, a lot of ways to propitiate the deities. And that's when, I think around the 9th, 10th centuries, a new way of Bon evolved, where they integrated the aspects of Buddhist aspects of spirituality, including meditation techniques, and then the monastic system, and then all those the canons were adopted, I think as early as 9th, 10th centuries. But before that, it was basic animistic, propitiating the nature, and then communicating with that unseen world through shamans and priests. It's just that basic thing. And then after 10th centuries, you would see the whole range of canons, Bon canons, that actually teaches all kind of threefold, Buddhist teachings, such as teaching on morality, meditative concentration, all those meditative techniques that you see. So you have the original ancient Bon, which more or less relies, it's kind of a shamanistic, animistic tradition. And then Bon now, which more or less is almost similar to Buddhism.
Yeah. With as I understand it, with still with a little bit more of the animism within the religion as well, as part of the sort of uniqueness of Bon, shall we say?
Yeah.
We said this is a slide we showed a bit earlier. You can kind of see here I think we've got manifestations of Buddha there, but together also with the deities which is kind of really fascinating. I think there was something I wanted to show people, which I thought was really interesting. Jigme, this is from the school of Taprisa. It's actually a mural that's on the fantastic school, which is the only school in sort of Lower Dolpo that's teaching also in the local Dolpo dialects. And I draw people's attention to the top left, which shows the deities within the sort of landscape, and it's something that I think people have a very strong sort of belief in. And I wanted to show people this photograph because this is what one of our guides, Dawa Galpo, was showing us. This is a photograph that a colleague took of the lake. Not very spectacular photograph in many ways, but the thing they were drawing our attention to is if you flip that photograph and look down in this section here, and if I zoom in on there, you can perhaps see that their belief that actually the landscape is alive with deities and the faces of deities. And you can begin to see some animals potentially here, the two eyes, and this is this area of the lake which is reflected. But it's not just there. People see the deities in the landscape all the time. Jigme, what's your experience of that? What's your belief around this?
Yeah. So again, these remote areas, by the practitioners or the meditators, they see it as special abodes where one actually has the potential of connecting with the supernatural, qualities of nature outside, and also the supernatural, extraordinary qualities within. So there are various meditative techniques whereby one believes, if you actually practice, there are changes that occur within you. You begin to see the purer and purer, more natural aspects within you. And then you also begin to see purer and purer forms of nature outside. And then the level in which you find a perfect vision and perfect harmony with nature outside and inside, that describes the path of enlightenment that these people actually, believe in. So anyway, the idea is to find that harmony between your consciousness awareness and then the environment outside, actually. And of course, when you read into the accounts of the meditators and others, you would see, actually, you could read the visions that they have when they live in these mountains, when they practice. And these visions involve all kinds of deities outside, all kinds of forms outside, all kinds, seeing anyway the supernatural, and then the perfect vision outside, and also kind of a evolution inside of more about joy and happiness and wisdom, therein.
Yeah. I think what you perfectly encapsulate there, Jigme, is that when you travel in an area like this, we as travelers can learn so much about some of these practices, the respect of the landscape, the meditative practices around trying to look deeper into the landscapes. Mm-hmm. It's also why it's so important, I think, not to travel as fast and just sort of skip through this. And it's just, this is something that actually, I've been up to Dolpo a number of times before, our local guys begun to point these things out, and it's just part of the evolution of these journeys. And every journey, you learn more about. It's humbling. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
And of course, not the whole area is Bonn. In the southern part, if we're moving now back down as we do in our journey, going up the lake, and then we move back down, we come back again, of course, into the shamanic Hinduism of the lower valleys. And even that, I think, is really fascinating. And that's one thing that's always really fascinated me, is that in Nepal as a whole, how these major religions have actually, coexisted peacefully for generations. Buddhism and Hinduism, and you see it in the Durbar squares, the palace squares, where you've got Buddhist temples as well as Hindu temples next to each other. And here, you've got areas of shamanic Hinduism, with the Bon religion interacting, very peacefully, very effectively. But yeah, Jigme, you've probably got an insight as well into this sort of shamanic Hinduism that exists in those lower valleys.
Yeah, so the shamanic communities in Karnali, including Dolpo, Humla, where I come from, I think they have the original. They're called khasas, and they also, like the Bon in Tibet and then the upper parts of the Himalayan belt, the lower regions where the khasas live. These communities, they also their cultural practices are also animistic. And they also recognize the mountains and rivers and lakes with certain deities and certain spirits. And one of those spirits is called Masta. I think that the symbol that you see is one of them. It's called Masta, and there are other various forms of it. And they seem to have existed here as early as 6th centuries. And some historians actually point out to the source of these beliefs of natural forces, and also the shamans who represent these natural forces. They trace it back to the early settlements in areas of Afghanistan, Iran, and even Iraq, and leading back to Mesopotamia and the Babylonian culture there. So they link it even back there, whereby the people have a kind of an ancestral deity within home, at home, and also deities in nature outside, in the forests, in the water, lake, sky, wind, and they have deities associated with all these natural elements. And then, so living, basically life evolves around, fear of these deities. If you do wrong, you will be punished. For example, if you pollute river or if you pollute forest, you will be punished. So you have to live actually in harmony with them. And then if you make any mistakes, you have to confess and pay for it. And then the role of shamans in these communities is very strong. The shaman actually is just the representation of these deities. And then the priest who communicates, because the shamans, when they are in trance, I mean, shamans can be like local people, like normal people, like any other social people or even leaders. But when they get into trance, they represent the deity. And then they speak in a kind of a special chant that the local people don't understand. So it's the priest who then communicates and then relays the message of the shaman and then the deity. It's just their role in Karnal region is very strong. Until I think 1990s, I would say even, even when I was young, I remember there was almost no cases in the court. Court is a new system, that came with the Panchayat rules in Karnali region. There used to be hardly any cases in the court because all the cases would go to a shaman. If there is some kind of a family dispute, communal disputes, or disputes about forest and then use and all those things, people would go to a shaman, and then the shaman would decide actually. And then the shaman, in order to decide, he would have to go into trance and take the consultation with the deity actually. And then it just people who had the fear of if you do anything wrong in terms of such disputes and fights, or even using resources in nature, they used to fear the deity, the spirit, and then some of this spirit, when if you have to confess, or if you have to make some offerings, some of the the Khasa spirits, I think they take offerings such as in the form of animals, in the form of grains and others. And then so that's how this things exist. And it's still, I think, the role of shaman and priest and then these animism is very strong in Karnali region, including Dolpo. But again, here, like the bone in Tibet during the 10th centuries, around 8, 9, 10th century, the changes also seem to have occurred in the Khasas also, where these original, like the Aboriginal faith system, the traditional practices and beliefs, they slowly become converted and aligned with, recognized with the Hindu deities, Hindu doctrines, as I think early as the 9th or 10th centuries, and they're now associated, even the Khasas, they themselves associate and recognize as Hindus, and these spirits also they associate with the Hindu gods and deities, but they seem to have their own original identity. And then their alignment and connection with Hindu system started as early as 10th century, I think.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think what this all is indicating is how deep actually, the religions are, and the exploration of these religions, I think, is just so fascinating. And that's why it would be such a shame to travel through this landscape in a fast way without interacting with these communities.
Yeah, because with these spirits, spiritual beliefs, again, there's also the healing system, with it. Even in the Khasas, there's a whole range of healing system. Some are like psychological, like healing system. Some other ways, like in the bone, you have all kinds of practices that have evolved with this belief system. The healing, the herbal medical system, the astrology, divination, and then cultural practices of making all kind of things have evolved, and that makes actually very fascinating to experience and interact. Yeah, so every time we go, there's new things we learn.
Absolutely. And actually, our journeys have slowed down from when we first started them. We actually added extra days in, we're exploring more places, because you just realize, how much there is to actually see and experience in this area. So so we are running trips. We have a trip hopefully at the end of this year. We've got a number of people signed up. There's a few places on that available, and we've got a trip that will happen in the times we walk is it basically April, May, and October into early November. That is a time which is good in terms of the snow melts. It's not monsoon time, which is over the summer, but also that people are actually in the villages and we can interact with people in the villages at that time. So they're the optimum times for us. So we are running a trip in October this year. So if you're interested, please do get in contact with us. and there's a few places that's quite the one in April next year is quite busy. So do get in contact with us for that. So if people have any, we're a bit over our hour, but if people have any questions, there is a chat. There is a Q&A chat box. If anyone wants to ask any questions, that would be great. I did have one question I'm going to answer previously that somebody sent through, and that is about language. Somebody was asking about the languages in this area. One thing to point out in Nepal is there are actually about over 120 languages in Nepal. So while Nepali is the lingua franca, it's not the language spoken everywhere. And in the north, in the Bon areas, people speak a Tibetan dialect. And I think even for you, Jigme, Tibetan is quite their form of Tibetan is actually quite hard, even for you to hear sometimes, particularly the older people. Is that right?
Yeah. So mostly in the higher belts, it's more or less a dialect of Tibet. But again, since these areas are also so much isolated, they hardly have any regular contact with the outside. And then for centuries, our communities have been living in this small pocket. So we have a kind of a special language, variation in ourselves. It's just difficult for people in one place to understand the language of the others, although they all come from the Tibetan dialect. But still, we have built over the ages our own specialty and our own smaller dialects. So it's difficult to understand even for me the Dolpa language, and just likewise for Dolpa people to understand the Mustang, and for Mustang people to understand Sherpas, Tamangs. So there are like variations. We can communicate, but there are so many specialties of that local area.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important actually to have local guides, who come in with you, because they speak obviously their local dialects fluently. And
then likewise in the Khasa communities, the Khasa language it's different from the Nepali language spoken in Kathmandu, and there are even within Karnali there are like variations in the languages there in the Khasa communities too, Khasa, Hindu, Thakuri communities.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jigme. That's been really fascinating, and thank you for joining us. And we'll be putting a recording of this event up on our YouTube channel. And so thank you very much, Jigme.
Thank you so much.
We'll be in contact.
Thanks for the opportunity.